Sepulveda. It took me an hour and 20 minutes to get into the airport and get, so I was not the only one because the traffic was so bad. People were jumping out of their cars. Now this is out on Sepulveda Boulevard with their luggage running towards the airport. So you know me, I took out my cell phone, I videoed it, and I sent it to the director of the Department of the Airports, Deborah Flint. Okay. So, because with that much traffic backed up for that long, it's gotta be an indirect source. I mean, if it's happening every day, all day, it's gotta be an indirect source. I want to tell you what the director of the airport's text back to me was. If you think that's bad, wait till the heavy construction starts.
Start construction.
Well, they have started in the middle.
No, not the heavy construction. So we need, I think it's Susan that's been working with them. Is that true or false?
Well, Zorik and Susan and Sarah and Phil, the whole team.
We need to have a serious conversation with them as relates to you can't do that, or we'll send some monitors out there. Maybe before we have the conversation with them, we send some monitors out there and find out if it's really a problem. Because I remember, and this is before everybody who's sitting at that table, I think, maybe not Phil. Oh, not Joe for sure. Not Joe for sure. Yeah, right. But I remember when, maybe you can recall this, Joe, when we sent some monitors out and put them at the airport on 2 different occasions in that turnaround underneath of the concrete structure. And we're amazed at the readings we got at that time. So maybe we ought to check in at night and check and see if it really is a problem. Because I just can't imagine. On Century Boulevard, it was backed up over a mile. Century Boulevard. I mean, it was back to Airport. On Century Boulevard, it was backed up to Airport Boulevard. Because when I went out, I went down Century Boulevard. So that's got to be an enormous emission source. Anyway, back to what we're here for this morning. Let's get that update on the mobile source measure for commercial airports.
Background. Yes, good morning, Dr. Berg, board members. I will provide an update on the facility-based mobile source measures for commercial airports. Last month, we provided a briefing on this item, and this item will be presented to the board for approval next month. As a way of background, as you recall, the 2016 AQMD included several what we call facility-based mobile source measures for indirect sources that were intended essentially to provide additional reductions that could be quantified and could be applied toward the reductions that were assigned under ARB's further deployment of clean technologies measures, or so-called black box reductions. One of those facility-based measures was the one for commercial airports, which is the subject of this presentation. These facility-based measures covered not only airports, but also ports, warehouses, rail yards, as well as new developments and redevelopment projects. Following the adoption of the AQMP, there were a series of working group meetings with the stakeholders, and as a follow-up to that, recommendations were made by staff to the governing board, and as an outcome of that, the board provided directions to staff for each of those 5 sectors. For the commercial airports, the direction was to pursue a voluntary MOU approach with the commercial airports because of the commitments that the airports were providing to work with us to develop their own air quality improvement plans and address the emissions from non-aircraft emission sources. So I'm happy to report that after almost a year and a half, we've been able to negotiate MOUs with each of the 5 commercial airports, LAX, John Wayne, Ontario, Burbank, and Long Beach airports. These MOUs are based on the individual air quality plans that each of the airports have developed for reducing emissions from non-aircraft emission sources. It's been a significant effort on the parts of airports to develop these plans in terms of developing inventory, forecasting the inventory, identifying strategies that they can feasibly implement over the next several years. And we've basically provided technical guidance in developing these plans, and through extensive negotiations with the airports, airlines, and other stakeholders, we've been able to develop these MOUs. And I want to mention that the MOUs only include specific measures from the air quality plans that we deemed were SIP creditable, that we would provide surplus emission reductions toward attainment of our standards in 2023 and 2031, which I'll talk more about. So under the MOUs, both parties have certain roles and responsibilities. The airports agree to implement the specific measures that they have identified and achieve the performance targets that they've established that would essentially require transition to cleaner technologies and cleaner vehicles, and provide annual reports to us on implementation of these measures in terms of providing detailed equipment and vehicle data, and also quantifying the emission benefits of these measures. In turn, we have been able to quantify the SIP creditable emission reductions for the measures that we deemed SIP creditable for 2023 and 2031. We are making federally enforceable commitment to achieve those reductions and provide the required reporting to EPA to demonstrate that the real reductions are being achieved. And we're also establishing metrics for tracking the implementation and a process in the event of any potential shortfall in the emission reductions, in the event that the actual reductions fall short of the projected emission reductions for these measures. And we're also obviously going to provide complete public access and disclosure of all the information that we're going to receive from the airports and all the quantifications that we're going to be doing over the next, I want to say, 12 years of implementation of these MOUs. So just going over the measures that are included in the MOUs, each of the commercial airports have proposed a measure for reducing emissions from ground support equipment. These are equipment that service the aircraft at the gates. They include things like aircraft pushbacks, aircraft tugs, belt loaders, container loaders, air start units, ground power units. Again, a variety of different types of equipment that they service the aircraft. And the emission rates that you see on this table are for NOx fleet average emission rates for all airports except LAX, which is a combined of NOx plus hydrocarbons because of their existing program. But the reason you see different levels of performance targets essentially is reflective of their existing fleet, the fuel types that they're operating, different equipment that they're operating, and different model years of equipment that they currently have in their airports. There are 3 measures for shuttle buses, for electrification of existing shuttle buses, and this slide shows the percent electrification that the 3 airports have proposed for their buses. LAX, 20% in 2023, 100% in 2031. John Wayne and Burbank, 50% in 2023, and 80 and 100% in 2031. And in addition, LAX has also proposed a measure to basically provide $500,000 in incentive funding to accelerate the purchase of zero and near zero emission vehicles. That they already awarded, I think, the funding to 23 vehicles, so they're already in the implementation phase of this program. John Wayne also is proposing to install a fuel pipeline that would eliminate the routine commercial passenger fuel delivery trucks. So in total, we're estimating that we would get about half a ton a day of emission reductions in 2023, about 0.4 ton a day in 2031. Just a minor correction to your package of slides. I think your package may have shown 0.36 in 2031. We had a minor calculation that resulted in changing that number to 0.37, which is more up to date right now. So a couple of ways at looking at the emission reductions in 2023. As you can see from the pie chart on the left, a majority of the emission reductions is coming from ground support equipment measures, almost 95% of them. The remaining 4% from shuttle buses and 1% from heavy-duty trucks. In terms of, again, reductions coming from airports, as expected, LAX accounts for about 80% of the emission reductions, followed by John Wayne, Burbank, Ontario, and Long Beach. Similar picture for 2031, again, in terms of ground support GSE measures, accounting for majority of the reductions, and LAX accounting for the majority of the reductions. If you look at the ground support equipment category alone, although I think we've heard that the half a ton may not seem that significant of a reductions, but when you look at the category of ground support equipment, we're actually achieving more than 50% reduction from that category, and almost 70% in 50% in 2023, and over almost 70% in 2031, which is significant for this category, which is above and beyond all the existing regulations that target this category. In terms of our enforceable commitment, we are making an enforceable commitment to achieve these reductions, which is 0.52 in 2031 and 0.37 in 2023 and 2031. Sorry. We are committing to track the implementation of these measures based on the annual reports that we're going to be receiving from the airports. And we're also required to report to EPA starting in 2021 to document the actual reductions that are being achieved and implementation of these measures. And we will make all the annual reports, as I mentioned, and all the quantifications publicly available so that the reductions can be independently verified. And in the potential event situation where the actual emission reductions, again, fall short of the projected reductions, we are committed to go through a public process and develop substitute measures to account for any potential shortfall. Again, working with all the stakeholders and airports. In terms of the public process that we followed in developing these MOUs, we've had extensive communications with the airports and their technical consultants, their legal staff, and also airline representatives over the last 18 months. We've had 4 MOU working group meetings. We've provided updates to this committee several times over the last year and a half. We had the public consultation meeting in October. And of course, each of the airports have had their own public process to adopt their air quality plan and MOUs. In fact, 3 of the airports have already approved these MOUs. LAX, Ontario, and Burbank have already approved these MOUs by their respective airport authorities. And the remaining airports, John Wayne Airport and Long Beach airports, will consider approving these MOUs by the Orange County Board of Supervisors and City of Long Beach Council next week, actually next Tuesday. And of course, all these MOUs are subject to the approval of our own governing body. In terms of public comments that we received, there were some concerns about the availability of actual operating data, which is an important parameter in calculating emissions. We provided additional language in the MOU to provide options based on data availability. In the event that actual operating data is not available, obviously the best scenario is to keep track of operating data based on the hour meter readings or maintenance record. But if that data is not available because some of the equipment may be older, we are allowing the airports to use averages as long as they can document that, and also provide defaults that ARB is using if applicable and applicable to their operations. In terms of equipment that are being replaced, we're also adding some language in the MOU to require reporting of equipment that is being retired, sold, or relocated within the basin. We've heard from the airlines that it's really expensive for them to move, so primarily these equipment are retired when they reach their end of useful life. But again, we're asking them to provide reporting to us so we can keep track of what's going on with the older equipment. We also provided some clarifications in terms of how we've done our credit calculations, and we provided specific calculation formulas in our staff report. Like I said, anybody can go through the information that the airports are going to be providing to document and track the actual emissions that are being achieved. Comments about infrastructure needs for ground support equipment, which also acknowledge that is needed, and We're expecting the airports and airport tenants to work together to achieve these performance targets and also work together to provide the necessary infrastructure that would be needed, for example, for zero-emission ground support equipment. Again, we heard comments that reductions are modest overall, but as I mentioned, they're significant for the ground support equipment. I also want to highlight that the aircraft, which is the largest source of emissions at any airport, is not part of the MOUs, which is obviously under the federal jurisdiction, and also cargo trucks, which are probably the second largest source of emissions at least LAX and Ontario. They are also not covered in the MOUs, except for two measures that John Wayne and LAX has offered. LAX has offered an incentive program, and John Wayne is eliminating some of their fuel delivery trucks. But other than that, cargo trucks are going to be addressed under our proposed ISR for warehouses. So all the cargo facilities within the airports will be addressed under that ISR. Also comments about the process of addressing the potential shortfall. We made sure that we clarified that any potential shortfalls will be determined based on the annual reports that the airports are providing. And we will obviously report back to the board if there is a case that these reductions are falling short, and development of any substitute measures will be through a public process that we will obviously pursue in the event of any potential shortfall. Realistically, we don't expect that shortfall because all the airports have really made a commitment to these targets. But again, this is in the event of any potential reduction shortfall. So our recommendation for December board meeting is to determine that this measure is exempt from CEQA, approve the MOUs with the 5 commercial airports, approve our enforceable commitments for achieving the reductions and the specific reporting requirements to EPA, and directing Executive Officer to submit our enforceable commitment to ARB for subsequent submittal to EPA for inclusion into the SIP. That concludes my presentation. Happy to address any questions you might have.
Do I have any questions for my colleagues?
I have a couple.
I have, good. Go ahead, Judy, and then I'll follow up.
You mentioned the target for the reductions is 0.52, and that's in 2023, and then 0.37 in 2031. So I assume that is a target. So between now and 2023, we're just working toward getting that ultimate target.
Right.
And we're to report to EPA beginning in 2021. So do you think you'll see emission reductions by 2021 that we're going to be reporting to them?
Right. So starting in 2021, airports are required to report annually to us. So by June of 2021 and every year thereafter for the next 11 years, they're supposed to report annual reports of exact amount of reductions that they're achieving. By November of every year starting in 2021, we're supposed to report to EPA to demonstrate that we are making progress toward those reductions. So yes, there is a process to demonstrate to EPA that we are making step-by-step progress toward achieving those targets. And in fact, if EPA is not happy with our progress, they would come back and require us to develop substitute measures by November of 2022. So it's a very tight timeline, but it's based on the progress that we're demonstrating to EPA.
Now, the other thing you said was if we don't meet the targets and there's a shortfall by the airports,
Right.
then it falls on our shoulders.
Right.
So my question is, where are we going to go then? Where are we going to look for the emission reductions that will make up that shortfall?
I think our commitment is, first of all, it's whether they're falling short of their target or not, right? They're committing to achieve their targets or not. If they are, there shouldn't be a shortfall. If they achieve their performance targets, we should not have a shortfall. So in the event that they do not meet their targets for a reasonable reason, I guess they need to demonstrate that to us. We could initiate a public process to look for substitute measures. First of all, working with the airports, if they can offer other measures within the airports, or through that public process and working with other stakeholders. So we're hoping that we can work with them, first of all, find out what the reason there is a potential shortfall and look for other opportunities that, or other measures that the airports could potentially offer to close the gap.
So you're going to return to the airports to look for further reductions. You're not going to go say, okay, refineries have to do it or something. You're going to look back at the airports and say, what else can we do here?
That's our initial offer, yes.
I see. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, Larry?
Just a question on, you mentioned the trucks and so on, are being considered under rent. Are the airport tenants, like at Ontario, UPS and FedEx, are they aware of that? Have you been
Yes.
talking to them? Are they involved in the,
It was actually at their request that at one point, they wanted to be part of the warehouse ISR versus part of the airport MOU.
that they are involved in
Yes.
whatever we're doing there? Specifically the ones at Ontario.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, let me start off with a softball here. Back when I was flying, and I don't need bi-wing jokes, okay? But the most polluting thing on an airfield was the APU. In your list of equipment that you were noting, I never heard it mentioned. Do they still use those? I would assume they, unless it's.
The APUs, if you're referring to the small engines at the tail of the aircraft, those are part of the aircraft. So they do operate them in the event that they do not hook up to the grid. So in those situations, they still have to run the APU.
And we don't have authority over the APU.
And you're saying.
They're not part of the ground support equipment.
Well, an APU by nature is ground support equipment because that's why it's called an auxiliary power unit.
Yeah, there are two types of, there's a ground power unit, you're right, that is on the ground and it can provide power. So that's part of the ground support equipment, yes. But the one on the aircraft is part of the federal jurisdiction.
The one on the ground, are we regulating?
That's part of the, part of
Yes.
the
Yes.
MOU.
And how are they changing those?
Well, to the extent that they can, again, we're not providing specific requirements for each type of equipment. So they are committing to achieve a fleet average of all the equipment that they can technically and cost effectively convert to cleaner equipment, either zero emission or the cleanest diesel that is available.
That gets to my question number 3, so I'm going to hold that. I really, when I listened to the presentation last month, I really was inclined to, we said that there were 80 million cars a year, that my recollection, 80 million cars a year that go around the loop there in the airport. And that the new program that they're instituting would take out 50% of that, 15%, which was 12 million cars. That's that new rideshare relocation lot. So I thought that was fantastic. But after my experience last night, I'm not sure that it's not offsetting. So I'd like to get some information on, how you view that situation. Now, what concerns me the most, we're talking about an MOU here. I don't understand what authority we have if they fail to perform. Do you?
That's a good question.
Well, Dr. Burke, let me start on that. The concept behind the MOU process that the board directed us to follow with the airports was that if the airports failed to perform, then we would undertake to obtain those emission reductions. One of the ways we could obtain those emission reductions potentially would be through an indirect source rule directed towards the airports. So you'll recall we talked about possibly pivoting to a rulemaking if the results from the MOU were not satisfactory.
Yeah, that's correct.
So how long does that whole process take?
Well, we could change
How
the,
long does it take to evaluate whether they're living up to their portion of the MOU, and then to add the Barbara's overlay of, then we'll prepare an indirect source rule?
So the first report that they're required to provide to us will be by June of 2021 for the preceding year, to demonstrate to us what they've done over the previous year, how much reductions that they've achieved. So that would be our first milestone to see if they're making adequate progress toward the target. So by June 2021, we will know.
but
So probably then the whole process takes 3 to 5 years.
we could move sooner than that, Dr. Burke. If the board isn't satisfied at the end of the first year with the progress, the board could direct us to initiate rulemaking. And
No, I think the way you really have a carrot and stick is you initiate rulemaking while the first year is going on. So they know if they fail, what's coming.
we can do that. Sure.
Does that make sense to you?
So the concept,
I'm just,
yeah.
Only craft the rule.
huh?
So the concept is to craft the rule language, but don't necessarily adopt it until we see the results, and then once the
You
results are
evaluate
in,
the first year's report.
yeah, then
so
the
that
board
they
has the
know.
discretion. Right.
Because, I think everybody buys into the thing, well, it'll take them forever to do this. But if they know it's not going to take us forever to do this, there might be some more motivation to adhere to what they agree to. When is the LAX, you mentioned that the other airports were either approved or in the process of approving. When is the LAX MOU approved, and through what process?
It was approved last week by the airport commission, right?
But the airport commission doesn't have the authority to bind them.
Does it go to the city council?
I'm not a lawyer. Barbara's my favorite lawyer in the world. Maybe second to Judy only.
Dr. Burke, I don't know
So,
the answer
but-
to that right now. We'll check.
Is it LA City Council?
Oh, that's up.
Yeah, whether it has to go to the council, I don't know.
We'll check.
Right. So when does it go to the city council?
What is
Yeah,
it?
I'm not sure.
November?
November 7th, she said.
No, that was.
No,
that was the board.
Yeah.
So they approved it. City council already approved it.
Oh,
City council?
City
No,
council.
no, the commission approved it.
Yeah, we're talking about
The
this.
commission approved it last week.
we'll find out,
You
Dr.
know I'm
Burke.
going to I'm going to check this.
We're gonna find out and get back to you, Dr. Burke.
So okay. On the old equipment, the dispensation of the old equipment, where is it going?
So they are going to report to us what's going to be the disposition of the existing equipment, whether it's going to be retired, sold, or moved within the basin. So they're going to tell us specifically by equipment type, by equipment ID, what's happening to those equipment when they provide their annual reports to us.
I'm not, your answer wasn't clear to me. Maybe I'm just a little slow this morning. The equipment is either going to be sold, that means it could be sold to another small airport in the district?
Yeah, well, if they sell it or move it to another airport within the basin, which is according to what airports have told us, doesn't happen usually. In that rare occasions that they might sell it to another airports, they will let us know specifically so we can keep track of that equipment as far as our credits and all of that. But what they've told us, as I mentioned, they are, for the most part, they are retiring their existing equipment, or they're using.
I heard you. I heard you. But if we're really negotiating an MOU, it would seem to me that we don't want that. First of all, we don't want it anywhere in the world, but we definitely don't want it in the South Coast District. I don't want to keep track of it. I don't want to, I'm not in the paper trail business. I'm in the air cleaning up business. So if I'm doing an MOU, do we really negotiate this thing, or do they just tell us what they're going to do?
No, we went through extensive negotiations. I mean, we required them to do a lot of reporting, especially after we released the MOUs. There were comments from public, from an environmental organization. So we did modify it. We think we strengthened it even more. We were asking for specific data that we didn't have in the original version of the MOU. So it's.
I can't believe that you would suggest an MOU that would allow them to move equipment within the district.
Well, they told us they do not. Well, Dr. Rick, they told us they do not do that. And to confirm that, we told them, then you need to tell us in the event.
If they told you they would not do that, do you know how many times I've done deals with guys who told me they're not going to do that? And 15 minutes later, I found out that they did it twice.
And that's why we asked them to.
So the easiest way to do that is, if you're not going to do it, agree not to do it, period. Don't tell me you're not going to do it. Agree to do it. Just my concept, okay? I would really like you to think about that. Okay. In the fueling process at LAX, is it now the fuel lines for the aircraft run underground, or are they delivered by truck?
That's my understanding, but we have a representative from LAX if you want to comment on that.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Dr. Burke, do you want to hear
Yes.
from LAX directly?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Come on up. This is Carter Atkins.
Yes, that's correct.
From LAX. Carter.
Good morning. Hi, I'm Carter Atkins from LAWA. Yes, there's a pipeline system that delivers fuel to LAX. There are actually 4 pipelines coming to LAX.
So you don't use any truck delivery for fuel?
That's correct. The only exception is we do receive biojet fuel from World Energy that's delivered by truck.
Okay, I got that. I know who they are. So all those little satellite terminals outside the main buildings, they have underground also?
I'd have to check on that.
I think you ought to check. Because my bet is that they don't. Okay? And you can thank Ms. Flint for getting back to me so quickly last night.
Will do.
But if in fact the satellite terminals are still using truck delivery, And in those small aircraft like that, I can't imagine they undergrounded it all the way out there, but maybe they did. We ought to look into the emissions caused by those deliveries. Okay?
Sure. Yeah, we can do that. Or with Zork.
Yeah. Okay, that's all the questions or comments I have.
Anything else, I'll come back.
Dr. Burke,
Yes, sir, Mr.
how much of the
McCallum?
ground support equipment is owned by the airport and how much is owned by the airlines?
Majority is operated by the airline.
Airlines, and then there's third-party GSE operators.
So is the airlines committed to this plan?
Yes, and that was part of the extensive negotiations we had to go through to get their buy-off on these targets.
Okay. The other thing, Dr. Burke, on your comments on the congestion and so on that you experienced, I've experienced it also. And right now at SCAG, we are in the process of approving the regional transportation plan. And one of the issues that has come up that we're talking about is, has the ground access to LA been adequately addressed? We talk about the increase in passengers over the next years, and our concern is that we've been talking about air passenger increases, but we haven't talked about necessarily the ground access to the airport. And when the stadium gets built and 105 gets that additional traffic, it's going to be a nightmare if that hasn't been adequately addressed. And some of us at SCAG are concerned that hasn't been addressed adequately and would affect our conformity.
So while I was sitting in my car last night in that traffic jam, I got lonely, so I called my youngest daughter just to have somebody to talk to. And she explained to me that it's in her district. The airport is in Autumn's district. And she said that her staff indicated to her that the reason that traffic jam is now occurring is because people are frightened by the publicity that the Uber X situation got. So they now are having people pick them up at the airport rather than taking Uber. So it's caused an increase auto transportation problems. Now, the real question is, when the Uber thing gets to running properly, and I think it will if it's not already, then will that decrease that automotive population going into the airport? I certainly hope so. This takes no motion, so does anyone have any comments? Additional comments?
Nothing here.
Public comments?
No
Is the
public
box of Kleenex at Palm Desert?
That's everything to say.
I'd like to say something.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm not sure that you're going to be ready for the December meeting. That's just my personal opinion. Okay, Sarah, I've been waiting for you all day.
Awesome. Always a pleasure, Dr. Burke. Good morning, Dr. Burke, members of the committee. So I'm going to give an update on our contingency measure plan for the 1997 8-hour ozone standard. You've heard a lot of these materials before. I know we have a stationary source starts at 10 o'clock, so I'm going to try to move through these materials relatively quickly and focus on the new material that we have here. So just as a way of background, we are an extreme non-attainment area with the attainment date of June 2024 for the standard. In 2007 AQMP, that was when we had our initial submission of the SIP for the standard. In 2016 AQMP, we updated this. That included both defined measures as well as these further deployment of cleaner technology measures, the black box measures. When you rely on black box measures, you have to come up with contingency measures 3 years prior to the plan provisions or before the attainment date. And so that's what we're working on right now. This draft measure has been prepared both by us and also by CARB. This gives you an idea of our progress over time since 1997. We've made a lot of progress in cutting emissions, over half, but from 1997 to 2012, and then another half down to our 2023 baseline, but we still have a bit to go. So our carrying capacity is 141 tons per day. Carrying capacity is just the amount of NOx that we can have in the atmosphere and meet the standard. And you can see that we have an additional 11% of reductions needed, or 128 tons. Just a kind of a breakdown again of what we said in our 2016 AQMP. Our 2023 baseline is 269 tons. Going down to our carrying capacity is 141 tons, and so we need 135 emission reduction measures. Of those, we had 27 tons per day of defined measures, but notably we were relying on a further deployment of cleaner technologies at 108 tons per day. So these Section 182E5, this black box as we call it, these are provisions are only allowed in extreme non-attainment areas. And the concept here is that in these areas, you're given about 20 years to be able to meet the standard. So that's a lot of time. Understanding that in that period of time, additional technologies could be developed, further advancements. And so the Clean Air Act allows extreme non-attainment areas to rely on this when they're developing their plans. But at some point, you've got to fill the black box. And so 3 years out from that attainment date, that's when EPA requires that we provide more specificity of what actually is in those further deployment measures. So in our draft contingency measure plan, we've identified emission reduction strategies. There's additional incentive funding that we point to, and then more importantly, federal measures and responsibilities. And so these are the emissions that are subject to federal regulation, not CARB or our regulation. And these, as you'll see, these are fairly significant. In terms of our identified emission reduction strategies, we have about 24 to 26 tons per day that we've identified through a variety of measures. I won't walk through all of these. We've discussed these before. You can see that that's it's a significant emission reduction, getting 24 to 26 tons per day, but it still leaves a lot, about 108 tons per day to be achieved. CARB also has some new measures. They total 3 tons per day. It's a variety of measures they have here, ranging from a new Tier 5 off-road diesel engine standard they're looking at. They're considering a locomotive emission reduction measure, a variety of VMT reduction strategies, and also looking at co-benefits from their climate change scoping plan for building electrification. In terms of additional incentive funding, in our 2016 AQMP, we estimated that we needed over $1 billion per year over a 14-year period. Our current effort, we're updating this information. For one thing, we're several years out from that 2016 AQMP, and so we're a little behind in terms of funding. Right now, our expected future funding is about $800 million over 4 years, again, coming from a variety of sources that I've discussed before. But we need additional funding. And so one piece of that is our voting district authorization legislation. If we are successful with that, we believe we'll be able to get $1.4 billion per year. We are still looking at other mechanisms, because if that is not successful, we'll still need to get that additional funding. But if we are successful with the voting district authorization legislation, we expect in 2023 we can get 15 ton per day reduction from deploying those incentives.
Is there a question?
Sure, yeah.
On the AB 2766 Subvention Fund and then the Mobile Source Air Reduction Review Committee, aren't those double counting?
I think those are additional, correct?
Yeah, but the AB 2766 subvention funds are $22 million a year, and those are distributed by the Mobile Source Committee.
So it's all that is summing up all the emission reduction funding for over the next 4 years, and assuming some reasonable cost effectiveness of the expenditures of that funding. So if MSRC does get subcreditable emission reductions, we can take credit for it, and we have in the past, but this is for the future funding. And then same with AB 2766.
So,
No, it's the same funding.
Mr. Mayor McKellar, the AB 2766 Subvention Fund is the name that we give to the money that comes from AB 2766 to us that we give to local governments.
Right,
It's a different
through the
fund.
MSRC.
No, they're two different pots. One pot, the MSRC administers, and that goes to our governing board, and you all see
I
it.
understand that.
There's another pot that goes
I
directly to
understand
city and
that.
county.
But the 22 million it's not the same number. We get
Well, you're
22 million a
questioning-
year to the AQMD.
Okay.
Well, I think it's not,
It's
because
sep-
it's $6 per vehicle, $4.
So MSRC gets 22 million
Well, we'll
and
check.
the subvention, the
That-
separate
that's what I
pot gets
believe.
about the same.
Right, I mean, we'll verify,
I'm just
obviously.
concerned you double count.
And,
Right.
yeah,
We'll look into it.
we'll look into it because the EPA would not like the double counting
Right.
either, so, okay. So looking at emission trends for major sources, you can see that we, again, in the sources that we control, that CARB controls, there have been some great strides in making reductions over time. But I'll point out the bottom line, the red line, that's those federal sources. You can see that in comparison to the other sources, they've been largely flat, maybe even increasing a little bit over time. So these are the emissions from aircraft, from ocean-going vessels, and trains. And then these federal sources are a pretty big chunk of our emissions in 2023. So about 36% of our emissions are coming from those federal sources. It's a big chunk of emissions that we need to figure out ways to reduce. So looking at potential federal measures that we think the government can take, and these could be measures that could be regulatory in nature. They could also come up with incentive funding and get these emission reductions through incentives. So for low NOx heavy duty vehicles, requiring that these vehicles are powered by low NOx engines. Ocean going vessels, again, requiring that vessels visiting California are going to be powered by the cleanest Tier 3 engines. For locomotives, requiring that we have the cleanest Tier 4 engines coming to California. And then also getting some reductions from aircraft. When we add this all up for identified emission reduction strategies, again, 24 to 26 tons per day, we think we can get 15 ton per day from additional incentive funding, and then federal measures or funding that they could provide could get 67 to 69 ton per day. All of those strategies added up will then fill the black box and get to our 108 ton per day target. So some key public comments. We have released our draft contingency plan to the public and we received some comments on that. Number one, concerns about the availability of funding, as we are relying, again, pretty heavily on funding to make up the gap. We are still continuing to pursue funding opportunities, both locally and with our state legislature. We are looking to the federal measures and trying to have the federal government step up if anticipated funding does not fully materialize. We also had some comments on zero emission technologies for the residential sector and counting co-benefits for climate goals and having some more targets on that end. To that, we have developed our net emission analysis tool, which is it evaluates the changes in emissions and costs associated with deploying zero and near zero technologies for appliances, for hot water heaters, etc. We continue to implement the measures that we have in our 2016 AQMP regarding appliances. And then we've also been deploying RFP funds, so for incentive funding, 14 million of which were for projects in residential and commercial sectors. And then CARB is also accounting for some co-benefits of their climate change scoping plan, which had a component regarding building electrification. Comments on emissions from the transportation sector and transportation planning and whether there's more that we could do in that end. We do account for emission benefits from transportation control measures in the 2016 AQMP. We've committed to work with SCAG and other stakeholders in developing the next regional transportation plan for including that in the 2022 AQMP. And then also we've had some questions regarding the timing for sanctions in the event that EPA does not approve this plan and how this all works out. And so we've put together a sanction clock timeline and also what potential actions would look like and posted that on our website. So bottom line, we've done a lot, we continue to do a lot and to work well with CARB in reducing emissions, but there's still a lot that we need to do. We really need all levels of government to work together to be able to meet our reduction goals. We do need more incentive funding to accelerate turnover of vehicle and equipment fleets to meet air quality standards. And we absolutely need federal action in order to be able to address those large chunk of sources that we lack the regulatory authority to address. Just real quick on our public process, I mentioned that we've already released the draft contingency measure plan and have received some public comments. We've had several meetings of our AQMP advisory group. We have been in front of Mobile Source Committee speaking about this contingency plan, and we've also had a public workshop. And then in December, we are looking to come to the board for consideration, our December 6th meeting, and then CARB will be considering this item at their meeting in December as well. So our recommendation is, determining that the contingency measure plan is within the scope of the final program environmental impact report for the 2016 AQMP, such that we don't need new documents under CEQA, to approve the plan and to submit the approved plan for CARB for approval and subsequent submittal to EPA. And with that, I'll take any questions.
You're on mute, Dr. Berg.
Mute.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. McCallum, I didn't mean to shut you off my thing there.
If I might, Dr. Berg,
Sure.
my understanding is that California is the only state that doesn't meet the core requirement. Is that true?
182E5.
No, the old,
80 ppb standard.
I think Houston is still non-attainment.
The non-attainment, the
think Houston-
0.084 measure.
Yeah, Houston may still.
I believe Houston, the greater Houston area does not attain either.
So I'm just wondering if the feds have any real impetus, considering the current political climate, to do anything to help California out, since we're one of the, maybe the only state that doesn't meet the standard.
If you can think of any, let us know. We don't think, we're of the mind that there aren't any reasons for the administration to help us. Other than the fact on the conformity issue, because that would affect other states.
On the, as I mentioned before, on the sales tax measure, a lot of the cities are trying to max out their sales tax to the 10.5% in anticipation of AQMD doing something. I don't think there's going to be an appetite for it in the public, especially since one of the cities tried to raise in this last election, tried to raise it to 10.5 and it failed. It was voted down by the citizens. So I just don't think that's a viable alternative going forward in terms of funding. Also, as I mentioned before, I'm really concerned that we may be overemphasizing NOx reductions as opposed to VOC, that we've got an imbalance there. I don't know if the staff is looking at that or not, but it appears to me that from what I've seen technically, we may be reducing NOx faster than we should be compared to VOC reductions. So I just suggest staff, if you're not doing it, look at that imbalance.
We've actually been looking at it pretty intensively. I know Phil and Sarah, the Chinese officials that come in, say the exact same thing to us, and we're able to demonstrate the NOx modeling in terms of the impact and where we expect to see the ozone drop-off. You may also have seen today in the LA Times, there was a recent article that talked about NOx reductions over the years. And I don't know, Phil, if you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I just read the article, so I haven't seen the underlying scientific paper, but it seems to, I can get back to you, it seems to support the idea that we're NOx limited. But a lot of the confusion over NOx and VOC limited, I don't want to get too technical, whether NOx reductions are effective or VOC reductions are effective or both, is what researchers often do is they take a year in the past, right? They'll take a year, they have great emission inventory, and they'll model 2012 or 2013 or 2014. And if you do that, there's certain areas of the basin, like if you're just doing LA County, you will find areas that VOC reductions are quite effective. But when you project into the future, which is what we have to do for our planning, 2023, 2031, and the emissions are very different in the future due to existing regulations, NOx becomes more and more effective.
especially at our highest sites, the sites by which we're judged whether we attain the standard. So yeah, you may get a site in LA County or somewhere else that VOC reductions are maybe as effective as NOx reductions. As you project forward, that becomes less the case. And if we're going to attain in Crestline or Redlands or San Bernardino or our sites that are the highest sites, and the highest sites projected in the future, there is no way to get to the future standards by VOC reductions without also getting massive NOx reductions. In fact, at that time, the VOC reductions become much less important than the NOx reductions, even if today you can get some benefit. So that's why we focus on NOx.
I understand. I'm just suggesting there may be a little imbalance there.
We'll continue to.
You know, things are moving from Redlands to San Bernardino to, you know,
Yeah.
it's moving west. So what's happening there?
In keeping with Mayor McCallum's comments, I think that we would be less than prudent if we didn't have a contingency plan in case this sales tax thing that we all are so enamored with, something should happen to that. And I know I only have 2 more years left, so I'll be out of here and I'll be watching from someplace afar. But it would seem to me that, you know, if I was running a business, I would not have my whole business plan based on something that I didn't have some control over. So I think Mayor McCallum's comments have merit.
We will certainly consider those comments, and we are working on a strategy, and I would say we will hope to present that to you soon.
Okay, great. Does that conclude item 2?
Yes.
Yes.
So Phil, you really don't need to say anything about written reports, right?
You're correct.
Absolutely.
I was just checking. You know, this is America. You know, you can sign your own death warrant.
No comment, literally.
Okay. Do we have any other business before Mobile Source?
Public comment?
Hearing none, do we have any public comment there in CC8?
No.
None here. I don't see anything from the,
Okay,
Tissue
we
box.
don't have any here at the Lux, and we don't have any in Palm Desert. So I'll adjourn this meeting until Friday, January 24th at 9 a.m.
You're done.
he took me off the other two.
All right, we're ready to go ahead and get started. We're